We will now hear from our final presenter, Dr. Katy Börner. Dr. Börner is an associate professor of information science at the School of Library and Information Science at Indiana University. She's also adjunct professor, associate professor in the School of Informatics, core faculty of cognitive science, research affiliate of the Biocomplexity Institute, and member of the Advanced Visualization Laboratory, where she directs the Information Visualization Lab. So that was exhausting just to read. I'm sure she's a pretty busy person among a world of very busy people. She is also the founding director, as if that wasn't enough, of the new CyberInfrastructure for Network Science Center, also at Indiana University. I am glad that she found time in all of this to come and speak to us. Her research focuses on the development of data analysis and visualization techniques that improve information access, understanding, and management. She is particularly interested in the study of the structure and evolution of scientific disciplines and the analysis and visualization of online activity. Dr. Börner.
I don't know, which one do you recommend using?
Both, I think, because...
Okay. So we try to use both.
And your ID.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for the organizers for doing a marvelous job in bringing those speakers together and organizing this meeting. I think it's right in time. As previous speakers have indicated, mankind's knowledge and our means to share it is increasing at a very accelerating rate. However, our perceptual and also our cognitive abilities to deal with this flood of information stay nearly constant. Many of us, if not all of us, are expected to know more works than we could possibly read and understand in 100 lifetimes. And as a consequence, experts become highly specialized. Science continues to fragment, to duplicate, and to reinvent itself. This is not what we wanted. Today, we use search engines to access mankind's knowledge and expertise in the digital domain. Those documents which have been digitized so far or are born digital. Search engines retrieve facts from a growing sea of information. However, we do not really know how big this sea is, how we can efficiently navigate to the useful islands of knowledge, or how this knowledge is interlinked on a global scale, or, for you most importantly, in which areas should resources be invested. It is not the first time that mankind faces this type of question. However, this might be the right time that there is actually an opportunity to coordinate efforts across different governmental agencies, across cultures, and across scientific disciplines to actually provide answers and tools to deal with this flood of information. And I think it's not only an exercise in showing the creativity of different researchers and creating tools. I think those tools are also desperately needed to actually preserve us as a species, to preserve our planet. The talk which I'm going to give is entitled Mapping the Structure and Evolution of Science. I will have 3 parts. The first one will present the results of a study which we did back in 2001. I think it's a very neat way to introduce you to what I understand about the NIH needs in terms of knowledge management tools. I will then talk about better means to collect, interlink, analyze, and manage scholarly knowledge. And this is on the to-do list of NIH if they're interested to get better knowledge management tools. And then the third part of this talk will introduce some work which we have done in the area of computational scientometrics, using bibliometric, scientometric approaches in a computational way, meaning over terabytes of data. And this could potentially be relevant as one of a set of tools that might be very useful for NIH. The first case study was actually funded and supported by Richard Sussman. Dr. Richard Sussman got an Express Award on investigating methodologies for assessing research excellence in the social and behavioral sciences in 2001. And researchers at ISI, but also my colleague Kevin Boyack at Sandia National Labs and myself were invited to map the domain of aging research. Back then, we got as NIA's most actionable questions, this list of 10 questions. They wanted to know what are the major research areas, experts, institutions, regions, grants, publications, journals in aging research. They wanted to know what areas are most insular, mostly sites themselves. They wanted to know the main connections for each of the areas. They wanted to also know the relative speed of areas, which becomes even more interesting if you compare humanities with physics, one living on books and the other one benefiting from e-prints. They wanted also to know what research areas are evolving and in how far their grant support actually influenced this evolution. They wanted to know the citation rate of grantees compared with other social and behavioral scientists and life scientists. They wanted to know how influential the NAS reports have been and how does NIA funding influence the number and quality of publications. In addition to just looking and counting publications and citations, they wanted to also know the impact in terms of press coverage, congressional presentations, etc. And the 10th question, I think, still needs clarification, how to measure progress. We also got different indices of an individual researcher's productivity based on success and discovery stories, based on publications in top science journals, based on disciplinary or publications in disciplinary journals, based on citations of papers, but also major honors, media coverage, recent public policy activities, etc. But they were also interested to see that the results do not only stay in the area of aging research, but also impact research outside their own field. The third list, which we received, were indices of the vitality of research fields. And here, the average age of researchers in a field seemed to be an indicator. Employment of postdocs in the field, employment of postdocs in the private sector, rapidity of publications of new results in leading journals, speed of promotion and tenure, but then also concentrations of centers of excellence, the size of project teams over time, and the number of projects with multiple institutions. Based on those questions, we tried to get the best data sets which might help answer some of those questions. And I believe still today we wouldn't have much better data, a little bit better data, but it's 5 years after we actually conducted the study. And I think still you would actually go to Medline, you would go to ISI, and in Medline we actually did a query for aging entitled abstracts or mesh, and retrieved 28,000 plus articles. Concerns with this particular type of data is that there are no citation links. Not all relevant journals were covered. ISI data was also provided. Here, 32 merit scholars, all their papers were received, and then all the papers citing those merit scholar works. And this way, 26,000 plus papers were received. For the demonstration work, we only received the bibliographic entries, no abstracts or keywords, which obviously limited this analysis. In general, there is no data on books, media coverage, awards, Nobel Prizes, etc. For the funding part, we got NIA data. This mostly came from the grant database. There are different name formats, changing codes. Most grants were actually multi-year grants with several subcontracts, changing names and titles, etc. We also get to parse, and this actually took up most of the time we spent on this work, BSR accomplishment reports. And they allowed us to now interlink grants with publications. NSF's fast lane system is actually very nice in this case, as you have to, as an PI, report your progress. And there you also report not only publications, but also media coverage and software releases, etc. So they already have a system in place to collect this kind of knowledge in a cleaner fashion. Our grant publication linkage, which we extracted with writing lots of different parsers and using all the cleaning methods available, might not be perfect. Here are just some of the examples of the progress reports which we received, which had to be parsed by hand. And as you see, PIs use the style of reference citation format which they were most familiar with, or which they liked best. And that's very bad for automatic extraction of data. Based on this data, you can then identify the top journals. You can identify how many publications were published in which journal. If Medline has an entry of this journal, if ISI has it listed. And you can also look at the impact factor. Interestingly, it occurs that aging research published in medical journals, given that the medical journals have a higher impact factor, those publications might have a higher impact factor as well. So it could be interesting to actually tell your PIs to publish more in those journals just to increase the impact factors. You can then also look at the number of NIA grants awarded and the average grant amount per year. Given that more and more grants are awarded, the average award amount actually levels off. And then you can do visualizations of BSR grants and publications. This is actually the first time that both appeared in one map. You can show the impact of funding on the number of publications over time. You can show the grant input and publication output for different universities, for different time frames. And you can also visualize, in this case, also supplied linkage patterns, because the automatically extracted one were too messy to use. For one grant and all of the publications, and in how widely it is used. VX Insight was used for the interactive visualization. I'm just going to present snapshots of the interface. I don't have time to actually do the interactive drive through the data landscape here, but I'm happy to demo afterwards. The tool allows, it's a database-driven visualization interface. It allows to load data sets, to lay them out in a space where peaks, these mountain peaks, represent larger numbers of documents which are all underneath those peaks, and documents which are similar according to some kind of measure. Either they are cited together or they have the same words in their titles and keywords, are going to be clustered more closely in space. And then you can also turn on and off linkages between different elements. You can run queries interactively against the data, which then highlights different entities. Here you see a map of all of aging research, grants and publications. Mesh words were used as a basis for clustering. The height of each peak is proportional to the number of documents in the peak. And as you see here, disability is shown in white. So you query the database for documents and grants related to disability, given in gray. Economics, retirement is in light gray, and demographics is given in black. You can then use this entire landscape and you can look at it at different time slices. Here you have a 95 to 96 time slice and a 99 to 2000 time slice. And these arrows here indicate if the number of documents underneath such a mountain is growing or declining or becoming wider, and then you can zoom into those peaks and you can see how much funding actually went into those and how many publications came out. You can also query, of course, for very specific details such as large grants, which are here shown in dark colored dots, and for smaller grants, which are colored in white here. If you look at the grant and citation data for 30 institutions, the top 30 institutions funded by NIA, you see that the University of Michigan and Duke University actually received the highest grant amounts in 93 to 97. They also produced quite a number of papers, and these papers got very well cited. These citing papers are actually the papers which cite those papers which came out of grant support. And you see that the sites for those papers are very, very small compared to the sites for the papers which actually received grant support. If you then take University of Michigan and Duke University and overlay them on the same landscape, then you can see that Duke University with white markers has a more focused portfolio, whereas Michigan University seems to be more widely dispersed during this 99 to 2000 time period. Obviously, you could take any institution, any PI, any research team and map their grants or their publications for a very specific time frame. And you can also look at it over time, look at the growth and decline over time. These are the also supplied linkages for one of the 32 merit scholars, namely James Vopel. And here the database was queried for author is like Vopel, and we received 35 papers, and PI name is like Vopel, resulting in 2 grants. And you see how these grants are interlinked with the different papers in this total landscape of mapping aging research. Recommendations we gave to NIA back then, based on this study, was to create a clean and maintainable scholarly database for NIA grants and publications, which would then provide a better basis to do these kind of analysis. The idea was that NIA would enter new program announcements, awarded grants. Researchers would enter relevant data such as papers and patents and media coverage, policy changes, honors, how many students graduated, etc. And they should also be asked to actually provide new result impact headline in a standard form entry format, so that the general public also finds out how important and what was actually achieved in a certain project. We even went so far, not in print, but face-to-face, to suggest that in order to make PIs enter this information, especially after the project is actually over, to keep 10% of the total award amount away from the PIs until they have actually entered this information. And I think this would make many of us actually do this job. Publishers would input publications, for instance, Medline report, records, impact factors, etc. And we also recommended to actually make the data and also the results of this analysis publicly available. If you do this, then the scholarly database and the associated knowledge mining tools and knowledge management tools would enable cross-disciplinary information access and transfer between different research areas. You would get an overview of all of science, and you could zoom into your specific area of science, or keep this global view and just test if anybody out there ever cited you outside of your own domain, or if one grant actually had an impact on other domains of research. You could potentially reveal unproductive duplication, unrealized complementarity, gaps in opportunities, and overlapping topics. We believe it would facilitate cross-disciplinary collaboration, and it would also help establish research priorities, because you would have this bird's eye view again, which you don't have right now if you just look at lists, maybe rank-ordered lists of grants and PIs and papers and institutions. You are not having this global view at the moment. You would also create new opportunities for scientists to systematically think about the state of their field. And ideally, and maybe that's too ideal to be true, you would achieve consensus of what should be funded. A new PI could feed in his or her abstract. He or she would see what other work already exists, what funding exists, and he could try to compare him or herself with those teams, maybe collaborate with them, or if it's truly a new, better idea, go apply for funding. The advantages for BSR and IA, which we pointed out, was that you would be able to monitor long-term money flow and research developments. You could look at the different funding strategies for different programs, and you would see their impact over time on the different research areas. Staff resources could be used for scientific program development, to identify areas for future development, and also to stimulate new research areas. But there are not only advantages for governmental agencies, there's also the advantage for researchers, because we would have much easier access to research results, funding programs, success rates, potential collaborators, etc. In fact, this system was envisioned as a kind of screensaver, very similar to SETI at home, and you would just have it on your screen. And when you come into work in the morning, you would see your research area, or all of science, depending on what you like to have. And if you zoom into your field of research, you would see, wow, there's a new funding opportunity, let's check it out. Or, wow, somebody cited me. Or there's a new paper right next to what I'm doing, I'm not aware of it. Or, interesting, 2 of my collaborators just got a major award. I didn't know about this, why didn't they? And so on. I think there would be a very neat way to actually be much more aware of what is happening. There would also be an advantage for industry. They could actually put dollar amounts on certain results, and they could just stick it on the screensaver, and people would see it in the morning, and industry this way could actually have an industry pull towards the research they are interested in having. Publishers actually would benefit from this. Some are scared about those visual interfaces to digital libraries, but I believe they would be a unique interface to their data. And of course, if you click at a dot, you would actually end up in front of Medline, or in front of ISI's holdings, or in front of CRISP. But you would have a unified interface to many of the different databases which we are using today on a one-on-one basis. The society would have a dramatically improved access to scientific knowledge and expertise, and I think this would be good not just to justify tax spending, but also to educate people about how cool science really is. So how to get to an organization of scholarly knowledge which actually allows you to run these kind of analysis and to get those insights? If you look at how scholarly knowledge is organized today, then you see that it's all in those uninterlinked silos. It's data silos, which are sometimes linked within themselves via citation links, but not all databases actually have citation links. And there are, of course, NIH grants, NSF grants, which are not interlinked. There are patents in different countries, not interlinked. There are papers, sometimes interlinked with other papers, but rarely so. And if a researcher needs to access everything on melanoma, for instance, he or she would have to go to those different databases and query each single one of them and get a rank-ordered list of documents. So there's a major interoperability and cross-linkage problem. If you have data organized in this way, then you can do text mining and data mining, or you can follow up the few linkages that exist. If you do text mining and data mining, as my 3 previous speakers have alluded, it works very well if the records are actually written in a similar style, using similar formatting and conventions of similar lengths, etc. If you have a thesaurus or ontology or other lookup tables, then this gets more doable for interdisciplinary texts. But if you don't have it, then it's very, very difficult. These techniques work less well if they are applied to interdisciplinary or multilingual data sets. Words have very different meanings in different contexts. Paper titles are oftentimes very creative, or they are representing what the author, all I ever wanted to know about X, or a unifying theory of X. So there's one word in the entire title which is actually referring to the content of the paper. Also supplied keywords are often useful to identify the uniqueness of an author, but they're very tricky to use to group documents. And again, controlled vocabularies and thesauri work very well. That's a very different story. And it might be the case that we are simply too different and too creative to produce the proper raw material to actually do automatic text and data mining analysis. If you look at linkages between the different scholarly entities, then Google is actually a good example for the power of link search. There are also databases now which support citation link traversal in one database. I listed a few here. PNAS even has its own online interface now where you can actually see the citation graphs. Other databases support citation link traversal across different databases. However, most of them are so expensive that even an institution like Indiana University can't buy into them, which is a true shame. And then there are databases which support even co-author link traversal and lookup of all the works by one author or all the co-authors which one author has, etc. And those linkages, they are very, very powerful to use. So what needs to be done is to interlink grants and papers and patents, especially if you want to correlate them. You need to interlink grant papers and patents and their PIs and authors and inventors. And then you want to use the resulting networks to actually count the number of papers and the number of citations per author, for instance, or per institution or per research group. And you can also use them to determine the strengths of co-PI author-inventor relations. So if you look at what this data organization would look like, it's not too difficult. It's really just records, which could be papers, patents, grants, and it's their authors or inventors or PIs. Each of those entity types actually has different attributes. Records oftentimes have a publication date, a publication type, topics. Authors have an address with information on their affiliation and their physical location. And based on this, you can then derive a lot more attributes. Because authors and records are associated, you can then assign geolocations and affiliations to all of an author's papers. And similarly, the publication date and publication type and topics can be associated with an author. So there's no rocket science involved. It's all technologically, this is all very, very doable, what I'm suggesting. There might be much more interesting issues politically, but technologically it's rather trivial. If you then have entities interlinked like this, then you can run a number of statistics which might be of interest. You can, of course, look at the number of papers, grants, co-authorship, citations over time per author. You can look at the bursts of activity. Bursts mean a sudden increase in the number of citations, dollars awarded, patents, collaborators, etc. You can look at changes of topics and geolocations for authors and their institutions. And then, of course, you can also visualize geospatial and topical distributions of funding, input, and research output. You can visualize the structure and evolution of research topics, evolving research areas, for instance, identified based on new yet highly cited papers. And you can also look at the diffusion not only of people, but also of money and knowledge over geospatial space, but also over topic space. So now let me show you some of the work we have done in bibliometric and scientometric analysis. And there are also a number of publications which recently appear. There is a Springer book on visual interfaces to digital library. There's a PNAS issue on mapping knowledge domains. And there are also a number of special issues of journals. It's going to be two parts. The first one is mapping science locally. The second one is mapping science on a global scale. What you see here is the growth of a co-authorship network of information visualization researchers over a time span that covers, and I have to wait until it's actually going back, 1988 to 2004. Each of the nodes here represents one author. The node area size represents to the number of papers published, so that's a lot of papers right here. The node color represents the number of citations, and you're interested in having darker colors, not lighter colors, at the end. And of course, some papers might be so young they couldn't receive any citations yet. You also see co-authorship relations between authors, here represented by edges, and the time or the year frame in which those co-authorship relations have been established or created is also represented by colors. So the darker ones are older co-authorship relations. The younger ones are more in spring colors. They are new and fresh. What you see is that you have, over time, a growth in those different sizes of nodes, but also in the strengths of co-authorship linkages. And if you look at the different groups which you have resulting at the end, then you can actually see that people working, actually most of the time of this data set covers, working in one research area and in one lab together in this way, in this particular example at Xerox PARC, they have very different co-authorship patterns than somebody working at a university like the University of Maryland, Ben Schneiderman's group, where he basically works with a lot of incoming and outgoing students. Very different patterns which are emerging. We use the same data set to answer the question if science is driven by prolific single experts or by high-impact co-authorship teams. And we had to do a number of tricks to actually get this answered on some of the contributions which are written up in this paper. But the good news was that for this particular data set, and this still needs to be validated using other data sets as well, but for this particular data set, it seems to be that those authors which effectively collaborate with each other receive more citation counts than those which are working by themselves. In another study, we tried to map the domain of melanoma research. So here we went to Medline and downloaded all those papers which have melanoma in abstract titles. And then from those Medline documents, we retrieved all mentionings of genes and protein names. Then we went to UniProt and GeneEntry to download more information on those genes and proteins, and then generated a map, which you see here, where the gray dots represent papers and the blue diamonds represent genes and the red triangles represent proteins. And you clearly see that there are some areas which don't deal much with genes and proteins, and there are some areas which deal a lot with those two entities. We had a number of our colleagues at IU interpret this map. And it was amazing for us to see how often they had to zoom into this map, how many zooms it took for them to actually identify the papers and genes and proteins they are intimately familiar with. We are not only interested to look at the structure of a domain, but also at its dynamics. Here you see the covert space of the top 50 highly frequent and bursty words. So each of those nodes represents one word labeled by its term. Those were extracted from the top 10% most highly cited PNAS publications over a 20-year time span. And what is indicated also is not only the year of the maximum word count, which is indicated by this circle, but also the sudden increase in frequency of this word or the burstiness of this word. Here we use John Kleinberg's burst detection algorithm. And so what you see is that using this color code, words typically first burst before they actually become mainstream used. And back in this data set, which ends in 2001, so back in 2001, the words gene expression regulation, growth, protein, and models were the bursting ones. It would be interesting to go back and redo this analysis and find out if they really became mainstream used. I already mentioned that we are interested to look at the diffusion of knowledge over geospatial space, but also more recently over science space. Here you see the results of a study where we tried to answer if the internet leads to more global citation patterns. So that means more citation links between papers produced at geographically distant research locations. And so here we use this very same PNAS data set, the 20 years I just showed. Those 20 years truly capture the introduction of the internet. And you would have expected, or I would have expected, to actually see over time that people cite over longer area, over longer distances. But if you plot the log of the number of institutions citing each other over the log of the geographic distance, then you see all these curves are on top of each other for the time frames 82 to 86, always 5-year time frames. And that was truly astonishing to see. And one explanation we have is that place still seems to matter. You might read more, but when it comes to actually citing people, it still matters whom you talk to most, who is in which review boards, who you have to face again the next day. And so some of the decisions might be based on the social networks which are underlying our activities. One of my students was very interested to identify fast and slow-growing domains in terms of patterns. And so he identified some fast-growing and some slow-growing domains. And those are as to be expected. But then he got courageous and thought, well, now I also would like to identify potential patent mills, people which apply for patents and hold patents to make money. And so we try to find a way to actually identify if there's a normal growth in patent holdings, such as like Apple computers, which basically puts always a new patent at the same area. These are the green areas which you see here. New areas which are covered are the yellow ones. These are areas of with the same classification. And this compared with somebody like Jerome Lemelson, who is supposedly somebody who tried to also make money with patents, you get a very different picture. More recently, we also started to map the intellectual space of Indiana. This is with support of the 21st Century Fund. They were very interested to identify pockets of innovation, to identify pathways which ideas take to make it into products, but also to study the interplay of industry and academia. And so here you have plotted grant support by the 21st Century Fund for a different project in Indiana. And you see academic and industry sites and their correlations via PI ships. Last but not least, I wanted to show you first results on mapping science on a global scale. First of all, if you want to do this, you want to have the very best map, because so many people are going to use it and they are going to rely on it. It's like you being a cartographer and mapping our planet. And as you know, the first maps of our planet were not perfectly correct. And so will the first maps of science not be correct, as we know we don't have all the data that is needed to map it in a comprehensive way. This is research in collaboration with Richard Clavans and Kevin Boyack. And this particular study, we tried to identify what similarity measures are best to use to get maps which have a high regional accuracy, are scalable to millions of data points, and are also readable in terms of the layouts they generate. So different similarity measures were applied. And then and the layouts which you receive by applying them are shown here. And based on this, we explored the software which I just introduced for the mapping aging research, was used to lay out those documents, and then Kmeans clustering was applied to get different clusters of, in this case, journals. And those clusters were then compared to actual category memberships according to ISI classifications, using the entropy mutual information method by Gibbons and Roth. And you see that the set score actually is pretty similar for a number of those similarity measures. We ultimately decided to use the Jacquard similarity measures here in green to plot one of the very first maps of science, which you see here. This map is comprised of 7,121 journals from the 2000 ISI file year. It's oriented in a way that science, as the most purest kind of science, is at the top. Then as you go down, there's physics and chemistry and earth sciences, medicine and biology, psychology, social sciences, library and information science, back to math. Actually, statistics is right down here. If you take this map, you can then actually cluster and group major journals together. And so here you see 212 nodes, which represent clusters of journals from different disciplines. Nodes are labeled by their dominant ISI category name. The circle sizes, particularly the area size here, denotes the number of journals in each cluster. And the circle color depicts the independence of each cluster. So you can look for darker colors which depict greater independence. And the lines here actually denote the relationships between disciplines. And I can see this on my computer. You won't really be able to read this here. Typically, what you need to do in order to see all of science, you need to print it out. 600 dpi, very large. And that's one reason why we also have the Places and Spaces exhibit up in the atrium, so that you can actually look at those maps in large and to see who is truly feeding into whose area. You can zoom into this map. Here in this particular case, we're going to zoom into information and library science and finance. And then you see the different journals which actually make up library science and finance. And you also see the strongest relationships. Kevin and Richard also allowed me to share the most recent map of science based on paper level data now. So here you have a map of 1 million papers, and there are 24 million references published in 7,300 journals. And this is from the 2002, so a more recent file year. Still same structure, math, physics, biology, all the way back to psychology, economics, and there's this appendix to law, statistics, back to math, computer sciences hovering right underneath. If you have this map, you can then use it as a reference system, just like we use the map of our planet as a reference system to overlay all kinds of information. Ramon Barkin had this very interesting visualization of different animal holdings over time. You can now also overlay other information over this map of science. In particular, you can overlay funding patterns of the Department of Energy, of NSF, of NIH, and see how nicely complementary actually both are. But of course, you could also overlay institutions. You could overlay research groups. You could overlay all the proposals you just got in. So I encourage you to actually check out those maps in large. Deborah McPherson is here in the room. She's a co-curator of this exhibit, and she's also going to be available to answer questions there. And I wanted to point out at the end that if you want to map science on a large scale, you cannot just use a laptop to do so. You need major cyber infrastructures. And we are fortunate to have funding from NSF to create an InfoVis cyber infrastructure, which is actually funded out of a career award. And we also recently received funding to create a network workbench for network scientists, such as biologists, physicists, social scientists, but also people which are interested to map large-scale scholarly networks on a grand scale, such as me. And last but not least, I would like to acknowledge all the many people in my lab and all the funding which made this work possible. Thank you so much.